I recently finished this painting, and this one compositional mistake, which relates to architectural shape design, can upend the entire thing. Today we're going to be talking about how you can avoid this and more. Alright, so I recently finished this painting, and I noticed while I was painting it, and also when I was designing the entire composition, that there was something wrong with it, but I wasn't really sure why. So I looked into it, and I remembered this article that I read from this one really good website. It's called the Institute of Traditional Architecture, and you can see he goes over focal points and framing mechanisms. And this is really important because I think this is actually the core of a lot of shape design, and honestly a lot of abstract design when it's concerned with any sort of art. It could be even music, right? It doesn't even need to be visual. When you're creating any sort of communication, humans like to perceive it and receive it in the same sort of way. The world is a very complex place, and when you're taking a visual thing like a painting, there's an infinite amount of information to present. And when you're presenting an infinite amount of information, the conscious mind cannot take in that much information at once. The best way to actually portray infinite information is through some sort of uniform narrative. Essays, in music, in painting, you have a narrative structure, and whenever you have a proper narrative structure, it always is received better by the subconscious, and then people get a better emotional resonance with it. And that's to say, every song has a chorus, every essay has a thesis, every painting has a subject, and then around that subject you have the context. Around that chorus you have the verses, and then around the subject of the architecture you have the framing mechanisms. And today I'm going to be breaking down how you actually create this narrative structure and why it can, if you do it wrong, it can create a lot of emotional confusion. So in architecture, you have something called framing mechanisms, and then you have something called points. And in that article I just showed you, he goes over this in depth, and I would highly suggest looking at his website because there's so much to learn. It doesn't even have to be for architecture. It's directly applicable to painting. I would highly suggest checking it out. But anyways, I'm going to kind of give you the footnotes here about what he was talking about and how it directly relates to painting to make it more relevant. But he gives this building in particular, and he notices and he illustrates, when I read this, my mind was blown. I actually had to I was walking while I was reading it because I do a lot of reading while I'm walking. And I stopped there and I was just like, wow. I mean, this is like the core of composition. I mean, you can spend years trying to understand composition. This is like right at the center of it. So just like I was talking about where, in a composition, if you just make a really simple one, you need to have a subject, and then you create a bunch of abstract design to make it feel like that subject is important, right? So you can do that through all sorts of mechanisms, and it all has to do with the fundamentals of art. So, one way of doing it, for example, is by creating a shape difference. So if you have an overall composition, let's say, and the subject is a circle, then if you create a bunch of geometric shapes within that composition, then it's going to feel important, right? And it's the same in, a song's chorus is only as good as the verses are kind of leading up to the chorus, and just as the verses supplement the chorus, and just as the verses lead you into it, but it's like a tease. It's not really giving you what you want. It's kind of framing it in such a way that there's all this difference, so that the lower you push down the verse, then the higher you raise the chorus. And it's the same sort of idea in art. The subject, which is the entire point of your painting, and this is what modernist art really gets wrong, is that they confuse the point with the concept, and then they forget about the context, which is a big problem in their abstract design. It's all about the concept. But the problem is that, information is so complex that it really cannot be distilled, at least really good art cannot be distilled down purely into the point. It's like if you took an entire great novel and then you try to just take the takeaway lesson, when we were all in kindergarten, what's the takeaway lesson in this book? You try to take that, and then you just told that to somebody and expected them to understand the entire book and have the same emotional resonance. You just don't get it, right? For narrative structure, you need the context and you need the point. And if you focus too much on the point, then you lose it because you don't have that abstract difference. So one way of creating this abstract difference to create a sense of importance for the subject, which look at any sort of painting that you love, any sort of building that you love, anything that you, right? Any sort of art that really speaks to you, it's going to follow in line with this sort of structure. And you can create it through shape design, like I showed you here. You can create it through values, right? If we make this really light because the surrounding area is really dark, it's going to feel way more important. It's going to jump out at you. You can create it through textures, right? Like if the rest of the painting isn't textured and then you add in like a really weird texture right in the subject, then that's going to do it. And you can also reverse these things, right? What if the background is white and then the subject is black, right? What if the subject had no texture and the rest of it had texture? You see, so creating this abstract difference is really what pushes forward the design, because subconsciously, for some reason, we're wired to take in information this way, and it makes a lot of sense for visual processing. But when we're trying to communicate visually, you have to understand what's happening psychologically, because art is a psychological domain. I mean, that's what it is. Without human beings, a painting is just linseed oil and pigment on a bunch of dead woven plants. Without human beings, there's no sort of psychological understanding behind that. So it has to do with psychology, and it has to do with all this stuff. So we need to understand how we're actually using all of these fundamentals, how the subconscious is going to take in all of this information. And then if you understand that, man, you can create some really, really powerful paintings. But anyway, so let's look at this as far as the abstract design is concerned. You have this composition, which has a really interesting, like, this is so cool. Okay, so the building follows this, right? If you really wanted to abstractly simplify it down, it is tapering continually. You can see that on every single floor, it tapers, right? Tapers, and then this also tapers. So what's happening, although this is, an oversimplification, you could say, this is essentially abstractly what your brain reads, is that this is a point. And a funny thing that we need to talk about too is linguistically, think about why do we say the point? Why do we say the point, right? That's very weird. That's a weird idea. Somebody's blabbing on, you say, okay, get to the point, right? The point. That's really weird. But visually, that's what you're creating in every single sort of painting. Any beautiful painting is going to include a point. So that's why triangular composition works so well. Well, it works, any design decision works well for multiple different reasons if it's a good design decision. But one of the reasons is because it creates this visual point. And a visual point has a visual subject, right? Like we were talking about. Because these leading lines, these are like leading lines. And any sort of tapered shape, like I've talked about before on my channel, is going to have a flow through it. So when you have a tapered shape, it has an inherent subject. Your mind reads it as a narrative, actually, through shape design. So you're reading this as a narrative, but the point is only as pointy as the framing mechanism is loose and sort of framey. Now, let me break that down. So you have, what's the opposite of a triangle? The opposite of a triangle is something that doesn't taper, but it expands at the top. So it's something that actually goes something like that. And anything, honestly, that expands at the top is going to be mimicking this sort of thing. And I'm going to break down some paintings and how they actually used architecture in the background to do this framing mechanism thing. But you can see that this reads different and these kind of read very similar. And basically a good composition, because the subject needs to follow this sort of point, otherwise the viewer is going to feel like it's not as pointy as it could be, if that makes sense. What's going to happen is in your shape design, kind of like how you never want to use your darkest values not near the subject, and you never want to use your lightest values not near the subject. Ideally in your subject, you're going to have the darkest dark and you're going to have the lightest light. And it's very similar with your shape design. You don't want to just throw out triangles all over the place, right? If you have just triangle, 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 then it's a sea of importance, and then your mind doesn't know what's actually important, what isn't important. So you want to savor those triangles just for the subject. And it's the same in this, this design right here. You have this triangle, and then you have this tapered shape with the dome. And then you also have this tapered triangle. And then the statue actually acts as a triangle too, as a point mechanism. And what's interesting is that columns, lampposts, and urns, and all these other sort of architectural things, they're not just ornamentation for the sake of ornamentation. They're using it to frame the building. So you can see here the lantern. Why is the lantern designed that way, right? Why is this so top heavy? That's what's something I was always wondering. But it's because it's actually not by itself, it's contextualizing the building. You have all of these lanterns that are saying, don't look at me, don't look at me, don't look at me, right? Don't look at me, because they don't have a point. Like the overall silhouette of the object doesn't have a point. So your mind goes, oh, that's not important. And it goes on, it looks for something else, right? But you have all these framings, and then you have the point right in the middle. And because the context matters so much, this point is only as pointy as the surrounding composition is not, as the surrounding composition expands at the top. And it's the same sort of design principle every single time. So look at this tree too. Trees work as great framing mechanisms. Boom, like this. And then even if we think about it as two-dimensional design in this image, part of the reason why it works so well too is because what happens is you can create negative shapes that create a sense of direction as well, right? So you have these negative shapes, which say go here, and then you have this, which says go here, right? And, you can use, here's where it starts not breaking down, but you need to understand the nuance of how to use this whole framing mechanism thing, is, when you're creating framing, you can stack the vertical elements. So vertically, you can stack all of these subject elements, and then horizontally outside of that context, you want all of those to be the framing mechanisms. So what that actually looks like is that you have point, and you have a point right here with the dome, and then you have a point right here, and you'll see that there's like 4 different points, and you would think that it would actually bother you because you're fighting for the attention, but it actually doesn't when it's vertically aligned. Because all that it does is that, because we read buildings from bottom to top, because our eye line is generally lower, right? We're not as tall as buildings, so we're gonna see at the bottom, and then we're gonna read up. So we start right here, and then this point, because the overall silhouette reads like this, there's the point, and then there's the subpoints within the point, and you subdivide it, right? So you can subdivide the entire building, and then as long as the framing mechanisms are all, stacked like this, it creates an even greater sense of importance. If you got rid of this pediment and you got rid of this dome and all you had was the statue at the top, it wouldn't be nearly as impactful visually, and it wouldn't be nearly as clear visually. And this visual clarity is something that's very important. But anyway, I hope I didn't lose you with all that architecture stuff. All of it's actually super relevant to this painting breakdown that I'm about to do. And then I'll finally get to why this painting doesn't work. So if we look at this epic painting, one of my favorites by J. Solomon, you can see this framing mechanism thing in full-blown use. So in this painting, what you have is another abstract composition, and you have your main, so you have your main mass, which is the main point of the painting, which is right around here, right? So if we think about it as simple as possible, you have a composition, most of it's dark, and then you have a little bit of light, and it's used sparingly right in the subject, right? So from a contrast point of view, this creates a very easy, it creates a very easily read painting, a very graphic painting. And J. Solomon did this a lot, where he'd create a very graphic shape, and then he'd create a gradation. And, check out the YouTube channel Draw with Chris, and he talks about this. Mind-blowing stuff. I'll do a video on this sometime. But anyway, so you already, you can already read the painting really well from a values perspective. But then on top of this, and this is the same sort of thing where you stack all the points. So if you stack a bunch of things that are working, that look visually important in where you're supposed to look, and then you ignore all that in the context, then it creates a greater sense of narrative, and it creates a clearer red painting. It's the same sort of thing, kind of abstractly in painting. So you have the values which are working for the subject, but you also have this framing mechanism thing that also works for the subject, and then the colors work for the subject too, where you have these saturated reds right in the subject as well. So what you're doing is that you're stacking all this stuff that your eye likes to look at subconsciously, and then once you do that, it creates a clearer red painting, because your subconscious looks at it and it goes, oh, there's red right there, there's brightness right there, there's texture used right there, there's a frame mechanism used right there, and it reads all of this in the blink of an eye, and then you look right at the subject, and then you can just read the painting really easily, and then you get this sense of emotional pleasure because it's a distilled experience for you. Everything's thought through, and it's clear as possible, right? The clarity is so intense. But anyway, so that's the simplest way we can look at it. But if you look at it from a framing mechanism point, like I was talking about, you have the main point, which you can see the silhouette follows these legs. You have this overall tapered shape. Just like how I showed you in the building, if you remember, the overall building tapers, but then within that tapered shape, you have sub-tapered shapes, right? You have these sub-triangles that are within the composition. Just like I have the pediment in the middle and then the overall composition tapers, you have the overall composition which tapers, but then you also have these subpoints within, within the greater composition. So although the main point is right here, the subpoint is right here with the face, right? And then right here with the arm. And what that does is that you basically have three main things that are all working together. And that's the most important thing. It's not about simplifying it to the point where you only have one point, one subject, and then everything else is just gone. You can add in a little bit of nuance. It's not always going to need to be that simple, because some compositions and subjects and stories, narratives we're trying to spin, they're not going to be simple. They're going to be very complicated. This painting, for example, there's a very complicated narrative behind it, and he's trying to communicate a lot of different things at once. And one thing is that, what's important here is that you have this individual, this guy, and then you also have this girl. And then on top of that, you want to communicate a sense of movement. So you have this hand which is communicating the movement. And because of that, you want a point on each of these, right? So the overall composition needs to be pointed because, is this important? Are these flowers important? No. The overall most important things are these two figures, and then on top of that, you have these subpoints which add more nuance to the flavoring, which is like, within the subpoints, is his hand the most important thing? No. Is his belly button the most important thing? No. Right? The most important thing is his face, and then the other most important thing for this girl is the movement that she's creating, because it adds to the overall flavoring. And because of all this subconscious stuff, design that's going on, when you see this painting for the first time, you feel that he is important, and you feel that her hand is important, this movement is important, and then you feel that the interaction between them is important, and then you start spinning this visual narrative in your mind where you say, oh well, like him and her are having some sort of interaction here, and it's very dramatic, and it has a lot of motion and movement, and it has this sort of power stance, and that's why the triangular composition feels so stable. So it has a sense of power, it has a sense of narrative, and it starts spinning this, but it's all subconscious design. And it's, you can break this stuff down for years. But anyway, so another really cool thing is that we talked about the framing mechanisms and the subframes like we used in the building. But there's also, this is where it gets really cool. He used the top like bed mold, corona, and semirecta of this lower pedestal, and he used it as a framing mechanism. I mean, this is insane. So you have this point. And he also, if you read Solomon J. Solomon's book, he said that you need to study some architecture if you're going to be drawing to architecture. Not necessarily for the stuff I'm talking about, but I think he said it because a lot of architects are very they would scorn painters who didn't really understand what they were painting, which, at that point it's kind of stupid, but but it's listed some sort of architecture, right? And what's cool is that this entire silhouetted shape, like I was talking about earlier, this reads as unimportant visually. It might look cool, but it's not going to be the subject in and of itself. If you actually got rid of, this, and it was just that pedestal, it would read as just a boring painting because it doesn't have a point. It's just this framing mechanism. Its overall taper is only as tapery and as important as this is unimportant. So you're using this shape contrast that I'm talking about visually, and it creates this even more importance. You're spinning this narrative. The narrative doesn't have to be super simple, but it needs to be simple to read, but it doesn't necessarily have to be super simplified in the sense of, you can only have one point. You can add some nuance into the narrative, right? It can be a story, but you need to make sure that it's all clumped and designed in a really in a really good way. Kind of like how if you had this subject, but then somehow you had an abstract shape that was also important to the narrative, and it was right over here, you would feel like that's just a really bad design, right? Because none of it's all simplified into this envelope. All of it's simplified in this envelope, and if you add in something like this, then you're adding in additional complexity that confuses the viewer. So you want to make sure that, just like how in the building, all the framing mechanisms, like all the pediments and all the pointed shapes were all lined along that vertical axis, make sure that when you're creating a composition, all of your main points are all clumped together so that they can all, talk to each other and make that one area of the painting feel visually important, more visually important. But let's get to why this doesn't work, now that you understand why framing works. So I'm looking at this painting and I realized, you know what I did? I made a sideways pediment, which is really weird. You know, you'll notice that when you're looking at this painting, you're caught between these two things right here. This is important, that's important, huh? You know? And then it creates a sense of visual confusion. And you can evoke any sort of subconscious emotion you want, but as soon as the viewer is confused, you've screwed up. I mean, that's really the problem. Because if the viewer's like, huh? Like, I just don't really get it. Everything else can work, but if the viewer's confused, they're going to go on to the next painting. Because frankly, people don't want, a painting is supposed to be an easily read experience, like I was talking about. Something that makes something look more beautiful is the ease that it takes for the subconscious to understand what you're saying. So as soon as you're like, what's going on here, what's important, what's the narrative, you're to the next painting. So, with this one, there's two things that are mainly screwing up the composition here. One is the perspective here. So the perspective lines, like the horizon, no, it's a little lower. The horizon's like right around there-ish. And what happened is that you create these perspective lines. And what happens is the overall silhouette here turns into this pointed shape. And also, it doesn't necessarily even need to come to a point exactly like that. It can come to a sort of suggested point, kind of like a broken pediment or something. But this still reads as this, right? If it goes like that, then it's going to read as a framing, but this still reads as a point. So it's the same sort of thing. This is kind of like, so I created like a broken pediment on its side. And what that does is that the viewer goes, this must be important, whatever's going on right here. And then you have additional, framing shapes like that, and this creates a framing shape, right? So with perspective, kind of like, you see the Last Supper, and that's a common art example of perspective used well, where you have like Jesus right in the middle, and all the, the perspective lines go right to his face. And that's good composition because it creates all of these framing, like all these points going right towards his face, and that works out really well. But it can also, you need to just be careful with perspective, because what you end up inadvertently causing is a lot of these pointed shapes that communicate importance to an area you might not want to communicate. And suddenly, the narrative of this painting, you feel like should be solely about this, and this is supposed to all supplement it as context. You have like the Gothic vaulting, and then that kind of tells you a little bit about the columns and there, and some of the ornamentation in there, and then you get a sense of the context, and you're like, okay, well, I'm in this hallway, and right. So, but the problem is the hallway is kind of wants to be important, but at the same time, you're trying to make the other thing important, and it just has this disconnect, and it just doesn't work as well as if it had been designed a little bit differently, and this stuff was taken into account. So the other thing that's also important to look at is the overall silhouette, like I've talked about. If you look at the overall silhouette of this, you have, it's not a point, it's a frame, right? So this is a framing mechanism. Now look at the overall silhouette of that, right? The overall silhouette doesn't read as a point. So the overall shape reads actually more as a tree or a framing mechanism, which is great for, hallways, because the hallway, when the designer, the architect created this, I doubt they really wanted this to be necessarily the subject. This is probably a supplementary sort of thing. And you want a lot more frames than you want points. So in this scenario, the way that he designed all the archways and stuff, is that he would have a little bit of a sub point, just like we're talking about, but it would overall be frame. And the problem with that is if you're trying to make that the subject of a painting, it becomes difficult because your eye doesn't really like that. It just doesn't feel important. So not only do you have a sense of importance in this direction, which creates importance right here, but even the subject itself feels unimportant because it's a non-tapered shape. The lines aren't really going towards a point, right? So you have, the narrative of the painting used to be, this is the subject, and this is a beautiful arch, and here's the context around here. But now that the narrative, the unconscious narrative is, don't look right here, don't look right here, don't look right here, don't look, it's like there's so much fighting going on between these two that the subject becomes the fact that you're confused. So that's a bad unconscious design. Now, you can have everything working for you. I think the colors and the values and all these other things really work for this painting. And that's why I don't think anybody would think this painting is trash or anything, right? But because you have this major framing problem, and it shows a lack of understanding about, the point and the subject and all these other things abstractly, it creates a sense of visual confusion. And you can have everything else work out, but if there's one thing you're really screwing up, it's gonna cause a lot of problems, right? So this is something you need to understand. And with one last example, I want to show that you can add vertically, and this includes paintings as well. You can add a framing, and then you can add, a point mechanism, and then you can kind of stagger those, and it creates a dynamic form. So that's the last thing I want to talk about. Okay, so just as we talked about before, the columns have a sense of, they're not pointed at the top. They have a sense of framing. So these aren't important. So your eye goes up saying, okay, this isn't important. But then the eye says, oh, this is important, right? So your eye goes, not important, and then it goes, oh, this is important. And then because you read the facade from bottom up, then you go, oh, not important, but then you go, important. And then you go, oh, not important, which is why the cornice also works abstractly, right? Because it frames the pediment, the roof. But anyway, so you go, not important, silhouette, and then you go, oh, important at the top, and then at the very top you go, not important, and then you go, oh, important. And then the other interesting thing is that it goes in this sort of fashion. So you can see that through this silhouette here, it's pushing out, and then it's pushing in, and then it's pushing out, and then it's pushing in, and it's creating this sense of like not important, important, not important, not important, right? So it's staggering all this stuff, and what that creates is this kind of undulation, and then you go to the very top. But imagine if, the most important thing in the framing shape design is what is happening at the very top of the shape. Or in this case, it would be like what's happening to the very left of the shape, right? Whatever's happening in the tapering direction, the overall silhouette needs to taper. So you can see that this pediment's way bigger than this pediment or that pediment, right? But the overall composition tapers. That's the most important thing. And then what's also really important is that you end on a point. If you end on a framing, the entire thing becomes a framing. So if this had a statue that went like that, you can see how that, like if you had a pedestal at the top of this, that'd be completely crazy, but you have a pedestal at the top of this, right? Do you see how that just reads weird? You're like, huh? Right? It feels just strange, but it feels much better to the eye to have that point right there. So most important things to take away from this video: subconscious design. It's so important, because that's what you're doing in art. That's the beauty of art, is that it's subconscious, but it's a pain in the ass to learn. But if you do learn it, you can do really cool stuff with it, and an understanding of how this relates to other fields can really give you a lot of insight into painting design. But anyways, I hope you guys learned something from this video. I hope you guys learned from my mistakes. I have a really exciting interview coming up where I'm going to be talking about modernist architecture in Cornell and just generally with a lot of universities nowadays. I hope you guys look forward to that. We're going to be talking about why the modernist conceptual way of thinking about art is just reductive and really has led to a decrease in the quality of architecture and fine arts. And I think it's gonna be really interesting. Comment about that if you're interested in that. Comment on any other videos that you're interested in learning about. I hope you guys had a great day. Hope you learned something. Go make something beautiful, and all the best. See ya.